One thing that struck me while I was doing this research and putting together this episode is our absurd obsession in the vet bro, gun bro online community with CQB. There's long form discussions and arguments about where's the one man going? Who's clearing that corner? Who's breaching the door? Where are the hinges? Who's pulling security down this hallway? Blah, 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 blah. Here you have Francis Marion. I will never get over this. He's 49 years old. He stands approximately 5'4", 5'5", tiny guy. He's a crippled. And worse yet, he's leading a band of guerrillas who 2 days prior were farmers, blacksmiths, normal everyday citizens. Most of them, if not nearly all of them, had no military training. Put aside the fact that no one's doing CQB training at this point in history. And he assaults a building filled with the most professional, well-trained soldiers in the world at this time, British Redcoats. And he does so utilizing speed, surprise, violence of action. He probably wouldn't have even worded it that way, but that's exactly what he did. And by using those three pillars, he's able to overwhelm and defeat the enemy in a way that is absolutely incredible. I mean, half the guys probably didn't even have rounds chambered. Many of them were using sabers that had been saws that they had repurposed from a sawmill days prior. And the British were effectively caught with their pants around their ankles. And like I said, he uses those three things, speed, surprise, violence of action, to utterly overwhelm them and defeat them. And he ends up rescuing 150 American POWs. No CQB training required, by the way. Okay, quick ad read, sidebar. If you've got a truck with a cap and you like being outside but don't love sleeping on the ground, there's a setup from DAC Tens you should check out. That's DAC Tens, spelled DAC Tens. No poles, no drama. Just toss it over the shell and boom. You've got yourself a weatherproof camp set up in minutes. They've got options for different truck sizes and SUVs. Hit the link in the description to learn more and use code DEADWARRIOR for 15% off. That is DEADWARRIOR for 15% off. So this is going to be episode 2 of our Francis Marion saga. You may have heard of this individual. He goes also by the Swamp Fox. He was played by Mel Gibson loosely in the film The Patriot almost 20 plus years ago, which I cannot believe. I'm going to do a quick recap and then we're going to dive in to the main body of the episode. In this episode, obviously, we're going to talk about the beginning rather of his time as a officer leading a band of guerrillas behind enemy lines in South Carolina against the British. In the last episode I did, very long format. I talked about basically his early life, his initial military experience and training, and what eventually would lead up to his career, his short career as a asymmetrical officer. He came from French Huguenot stock. His grandfather immigrated to what would be the United States, North America, and the colonies at that time. And he had kind of not a really interesting early military career. He fought initially, he was a part of a militia group that didn't do anything. And then eventually he would become a lieutenant and serve with the British Redcoats as a regular officer in the Cherokee expedition, where he also fought alongside or shoulder to shoulder with a handful, approximately 13, I believe, of Robert Rogers Rangers. Robert Rogers was not there himself, but a lot of historians miss this point, and I wanted to basically highlight it because, in my opinion, I think one of the reasons why he became so successful as a guerrilla partisan leader eventually in the Revolutionary War was because he learned small unit tactics and ambush a whole variety of different things from Robert Rogers Rangers during the Cherokee War. After the war, he went back to being a farmer. Someone in the comment section got super bent out of shape because I failed to mention that he was a slave owner. Okay, one of the reasons I didn't mention it was not because I was trying to hide the ball. It's because if you're watching the show, and you have been watching the show, best guess is you know quite a bit about American history. You are probably fully aware of the fact that if you were an individual living in South Carolina, as a farmer or plantation owner, you owned slaves. It was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. And unfortunately, for all of human history, up until the last 150 years, slavery existed as an institution on every continent, in every culture. I was not trying to hide the ball. I simply was giving my audience the benefit of the doubt that they would know that Francis Marion owned slaves. What's far more unique, by the way, about Francis Marion in the sort of vein of slavery and the institution of slavery is that there were many men who fought alongside him voluntarily who had once been slaves. They had been freed. Some of them were still slaves who were fighting for other individuals, as seen in the film The Patriot. And that was unique. There were not many military units at this time, particularly colonial or American units throughout the 18th and 19th century, where you saw slaves, not just a part of a military force, but who were actually armed and a key feature and soldier, a fighting force within those units. The revolution kicks off, and unlike the film, Francis Marion is a patriot from day one. He joins the revolution. Mel Gibson's character is hesitant to join the cause. If I remember correctly, it was because the horrors of war during the French and Indian War, and he simply did not want to be a part of that if he could avoid it. But that's not what happened with Francis Marion. He joins up very quickly. His first sort of military success during the revolution is the British had lost Sullivan's Island. It is a small island off the coast of South Carolina. And he is charged with overseeing a battery, an artillery battery, to defend the island and the coast. He's very successful, and he ends up getting promoted. And there is a lull in the war in the South. The British end up focusing most of their time and energy on trying to invade and take over the North. Eventually, there's a bit of a stalemate, and they devise a new strategy to focus all their energy on the South with what would eventually be known as the Southern strategy. And it is very effective. The sort of loyalist cause, the individuals who were in favor of remaining under British rule, that sentiment was far more dominant in the South than it was in the North. And so they rightly believed that they could leverage that infrastructure, if you will, to support their endeavors throughout the rest of the war. They end up invading, the British end up invading Georgia. They take they take Savannah. Francis is a part of a infantry unit. I believe he's a captain or major at this point. And he joins forces with a French officer who leads an army in the hopes of taking Savannah back from British forces. They are very wildly unsuccessful. Marion is on the front lines and definitely in the heat of battle this entire time. He survives. They eventually retreat back to Charleston, and it is simply a matter of time before the British take over the entire South. Despite the fact that they're on their way and the military and political leaders in South Carolina are aware of this, they are still having parties, dinner parties, whatever you want to call them. And auspicious. There's so many points in Francis Marion's life where it's pure dumb luck or the grace of God or a bit of both, that he somehow gets out of situations and isn't there when terrible things happen. And this is one of those moments. He's at a party in Charleston weeks, maybe a month before the British have arrived. And he hated people who drank too much. And so instead of walking out the front door to this party, he decides that he's going to jump out of a second-story window to get away from all of these drunkards. And he ends up shattering his ankle or his foot. It's unclear which. And eventually, not long after, the political military leadership in Charleston end up telling all of the military leaders who are hurt or wounded that they need to leave. And so Francis Marion is obviously a part of this cohort that abandons Charleston because he is still recovering. And then, of course, the British soon after take over Charleston. And had Francis not jumped out of that window and shattered his ankle, he certainly would have been there and potentially killed and or captured. According to the South Carolina Francis Marion papers, the authors write, quote, Francis Marion escaped capture when he fortuitously injured his ankle or foot so severely that he was ordered out of the city before its fall. After Charleston surrendered, he was forced to recuperate while he hid in the Santee swamps. By June, he had recovered enough to rejoin the service. If he had not injured himself, he likely would have been a prisoner of war after the fall of the capital or worse. So Marion ends up joining General Gates's army, but instead of going with the main body, General Gates deploys him to harass British ships along the Santee. Again, this is another one of those moments of pure dumb luck. Had he been with the commander's main body, the main force, he certainly would have been present at the Battle of Camden, where Patriot and American forces were utterly destroyed when they faced the British. And once again, he likely would have been captured or killed there, but instead he was not. He was off conducting other types of operations along the Santee. After the defeat, or right before the Battle of Camden, Marion begins to build his initial partisan force. And then, of course, when General Gates's army is destroyed, he's essentially the last man standing. Him and what would eventually become his guerrilla force fighting behind enemy lines. Again, Francis Marion papers summarize it this way. He says, quote, "He began to organize the militia in the area north of the Santee and east of the high hills. Unlike Sumter, who was able to gather a large force with which to combat the British, Marion had fewer men to draw from in the sparsely populated swampy region west of Georgetown. His militia operated in the midst of loyalist-controlled territory and within striking distance of regular Crown forces. Marion's men had to balance service in the militia with constant threats to their homes and families when they were away." Marion was taking a massive risk, and this really needs to be pointed out. There was no real higher authority at this point, particularly after the Battle of Camden, that was directing him. I mean, he essentially, by himself, was commissioning himself officially as an officer, even though no outside leadership was directing him. I mean, he just took it upon himself. And simultaneously, as we're going to get into, he had to convince a bunch of individuals who were just average citizens. They were farmers. They went to church every Sunday. Most of them, other than hunting, had never been in a sort of combat situation. And he had to take these guys and encourage them and lead them to fight the most professional army in the world that not only dominated South Carolina, but they also had a multiplicity of support and auxiliaries from the loyalists who were their neighbors. I mean, they all knew each other. I talked a lot about this in the last episode, but the Revolutionary War in South Carolina was as much a civil war as it was a war against the British overlords. Marion's militia, they were mounted militia. So unlike Robert Rogers, who was operating dismounted, if you will, Marion's men were a mounted force. They were on horseback. That's just the nature of the landscape, to put it bluntly, I suppose. But they needed horses to basically move around as quickly as humanly possible. One of the reasons why Robert Rogers couldn't or didn't use horses was because the landscape dictated that it was nearly impossible. There was just not enough forage. And it was more akin to a jungle in Southeast Asia than it was to North American temperate deciduous forests, if you will. Marion's men were poorly armed, and moreover, like I said a moment ago, were not professional soldiers. They were backcountry farmers, hunters, and just average citizens. Biographers point out how they had to put together all kinds of crude weapons. And even if they had firearms that they could use, many of them did not have shot that they could load into their firearms. William Sims, who wrote a biography on Marion in 1840, noted, quote, "The activity of Marion was necessarily strained by the condition in which he found his men. They were wretchedly deficient in all materials of service. His first effort to supply some of their wants was in sacking the sawmills. The saws were wrought and hammered by rude blacksmiths into some resemblance to sabers, and thus provided Marion set his men in motion 2 days after taking command." Sims would go on to note in the biography, says, quote, "Marion frequently went into action with less than 3 rounds to a man. Half of his men were sometimes lookers on because of the lack of arms and ammunition, waiting to see the fall of friends or enemies in order to obtain the necessary means of taking part in the affair. Buckshot easily satisfied soldiers who not unfrequently advanced to the combat with nothing but swan shot in their fowling pieces." It's really, truly incredible that Marion's force wasn't just wiped out day one. I mean, these guys were uneducated farmers who had no technical training when it came to soldiering. And not only that, but they were very poorly armed. Instead of relying on gear or technical experience by his men, Marion would have to leverage his own military talents, his own tactical abilities, and moreover, and I think this was absolutely crucial, his knowledge of the terrain and his enemy. Because again, just to remind you, he had been a British officer, worked among British officers. And so knowing their strengths, knowing their weaknesses, knowing how the British Army thought was absolutely critical to his survival and the survival of his partisan force. I've said this before. If you've watched Dead Warrior Society episodes, I'll say it again. Speed, surprise, violence in action will always win the day. Francis Marion used these three pillars to defeat his enemy again and again. And in this specific operation, which we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details of, it is because he used these things that allowed him to overwhelm and defeat his enemy. One crucial element to any military operation, but in particular to asymmetrical warfare operations, is the demand for real-time actionable intelligence. This is absolutely crucial. It is something that every partisan force is required to obtain either on their own, well, typically on their own. Sometimes they get it from elsewhere. But if they don't have intelligence, they are useless. And this is true of all military units, by the way. It's not just partisan, guerrilla, asymmetrical warfare forces. But I would say that one of the key differences between the two, sort of your symmetrical warfare guys and your asymmetrical warfare guys, is very often the asymmetrical warfare guys are, even to this day, left to their own to gather the intelligence necessary to launch operations. Whereas when you have a conventional force, you have all kinds of units and individuals, different organizations that can provide you with the intelligence necessary to begin to map out what your next move is going to be. When you've got a small force of 50 odd guys and you're completely cut off from any sort of conventional force, it's on you to go out and get the intelligence in some way, shape, or form. And this is definitely true when it comes to Francis Marion's first operation. On August 17th, Marion deployed Peter Horry along the Santee, south of Lanud's Ferry, to exert Patriot influence in the region, interdict British and Tory lines of communication, and gather intelligence and supplies. So this is his moment where he's like, hey, Peter, you're going to go out. We need some intel. What's the enemy doing? Where are they? How many are they? Like we need to know what's happening, find an opening, find a weakness, and we need to figure out where we are going to strike. Horry ended up taking a majority of the men available to Marion, something like 3 or 4 companies. He ended up leaving Marion with sort of bottom of the barrel skeleton crew, approximately 56 mounted militiamen. And the Swamp Fox ended up moving his small force to Nelson's Ferry, aka King's Tree, which is a very busy crossing point between Charleston and Camden. This is a crossroads. If you've got an army like the British Army and you need to move men and materiel from Charleston north and eventually into North Carolina, you've got to go through this area. Marion knew this. Also, it was effectively his backyard. And so he decided this was going to be a place where he would harass and annoy the hell out of the British in order to keep their presence in South Carolina and prevent their advance into North Carolina. Worse yet, on August 19th, British learned of the Patriots' defeat at Camden, and this was absolutely devastating. Just to remind you, this was a day or two after, I believe it was like 24 hours after he had raised this new force of guerrilla fighters. And he knew that had they found out of this loss, this Patriot loss in Camden, that the likelihood that they would just disperse and go home was very high. And therefore, Marion just takes it upon himself and says, I'm going to withhold this information from my men, which was the right strategy. Scott Aiken, in his book, The Swamp Fox, Lessons in Leadership from the Partisan Campaigns of Francis Marion, highlights the reality that Marion had to be very careful when providing his men with intel and notes. And he says, quote, Marion hid this newly acquired fact from his men. He kept the truth to himself in this instance for fear of losing men and his new command's cohesion to desertion at a particularly sensitive time in the Southern campaign. His unit had just formed around the Williamsburg militia and was not yet battle-tested or proven to be overly loyal to Marion. Losing manpower at such a time would have crippled his partisan campaign before it had even started and concede to the Low Country, to the Crown, to a degree from which the Patriots might not be able to recover. Meanwhile, Brigadier General Thomas Sumter, who is another Patriot, sustained a crushing defeat at Fishing Creek on August 18th. So just to set the tone of what was going on up until this point, Savannah was taken. A Patriot force was crushed while trying to retake Savannah. Charleston was quickly overrun after that. There was the British completely took over South Carolina. There was some resistance at the Battle of Camden. Once again, a Patriot lost. And then another loss by Generals Thomas Sumter at Fishing Creek. I mean, there were just L's all over the place. The spirit de corps, the morale of the men, must have just been absolutely defeated. I mean, the fact that Francis Marion believed so much in the revolution that despite all of these losses, and again, just to reiterate this, he is surrounded by British and loyalist troops. The fact that he didn't give up at this point is miraculous. If the British captured him, he would without a doubt be hung publicly along with all of his men. I mean, the risk here is so high. To me, it is just incredible that he stayed the course. The men were demoralized, underprepared, and near absolute defeat is an understatement. And like I said, there's a reason why General Cornwallis informed his superiors in South Carolina that the region, South Carolina, was not only occupied, but pacified. But the one thing General Cornwallis wasn't anticipating was a crippled 40-something-year-old, nearly 50-year-old, who was going to lead a unconventional force and absolutely harass the shit out of his men in just incredible fashion. I keep saying incredible because it is, but Robert Rogers is awesome. I love Robert Rogers. He was able to do some really incredible things. Francis Marion was up against the world, to say the least. By all available evidence, Marion and his small force should have been squashed and defeated instantaneously and just dissolved. But Francis, who I swear to God had a guardian angel, if anyone did have or has had a guardian angel, the next day while camped out at Nelson's Ferry, a Tory officer, deserter, he was an ensign, stumbled into their camp, was captured and quickly interrogated. And the soldier ends up informing Marion that after the Battle of Camden, many of the American patriots had been captured. They were POWs. And General Cornwallis was afraid that if those soldiers stayed in South Carolina, they would spread a variety of diseases like malaria and smallpox. And so he was leading them or taking them to a ship off the coast of Charleston, where he would load them up and ship them away and keep them obviously at a distance from his main army. And these individuals were currently being held at Thomas Sumter's abandoned plantation at Great Savannah under British guard, of course, not very far from their current position. And by the way, these were not just ordinary American Patriot soldiers. These were professionals. These were Maryland and Delaware trained Continental soldiers. And therefore, their recovery would be an absolute boon to the Patriot cause. According to this captured Tory, this deserter, there were approximately 36 British soldiers who were holed up at this plantation, overseeing the transfer of these POWs. Like I said, there were 150 of them in this body of British soldiers. They were led by Captain John Roberts and the 63rd Regiment of Foot, loyalist provincials of the Prince of Wales Regiment, and a few Tory militiamen. Just to remind you, these are the best soldiers in the world. They are well outfitted. They are armed to the teeth. And Marion is leading a partisan force of nobodies. I mean, they were farmers with like fucking swords made from saws the day prior. Yet Marion had 56 mounted men. As I said a moment ago, many of his brigade that he had gathered were gone with Peter Horry to do other things elsewhere. They were not battle tested, and they had not, obviously, at this point, been in any serious engagement. A lot of this stuff I'm going to keep repeating because I want you to remember it. This force that he had built, he had been overseeing them, commanding them for 48 hours. Think about that for a minute. For my guys who were in Afghanistan or Iraq, imagine arriving in Iraq or Afghanistan and you were handed 56 Afghans who were untrained, many of whom they may have hunted. So I'll give them that credit where credit is due, but they had no tactical experience. Imagine leading those guys on essentially like a hostage rescue mission where you were going to go recover or attempt to recover 150 allies. It's insane. I mean, it is fucking crazy. And Marion is just like, yeah, let's go. Let's do it. So Marion immediately gathers his force and says, check it out. We're going to go raid this plantation and we're going to go rescue 150 patriots. This type of mission, again, for those of you who have a military background, this type of mission would be handed down to JSOC CAG, SEAL Team 6, maybe Ranger Battalion, depending on the situation, I guess, and what's going on in the area. And they would plan this for months, if possible, depending on obviously the intelligence and what's happening on the ground. This would be like they would be informing the president as this was going down. And here we have Marion with his guerrilla force who take it upon themselves that they're going to go rescue 150 Continental soldiers. I mean, it is fucking incredible. So they receive the intel that day. Into the night, they travel towards the plantation. They eventually arrive at a location at a safe distance from their objective. Francis Marion, again, there's no Ranger handbook here. He pauses, sets up some kind of a patrol base, puts out security, deploys a reconnaissance force. Again, if you are from Ranger Battalion or you have any experience in the military, in a combat unit, infantry unit, this is classic, just SOP, small unit tactics these days. He sends out his recon unit. They figure out what the enemy disposition is, what the best approach is to the house, where, if there is any security, where the security is posted, just whatever information they can find out, real-time intelligence that could be used to better prepare to assault this objective. And Marion, the first thing he does is he takes Hugh Horry, not Peter Horry. I was very confused by all this. They have to be related. Anyways, he has Hugh with him, not Peter. And Hugh is the second in command, of course. He's the lieutenant. And he sends Hugh and a group of approximately 16 mounted men, and they set up a blocking position along the road where you've got the plantation, and then down the street you've got, well, I should say the plantation house, and then down the street you have the larger sort of plantation where actually predominantly all of the 150 Continental soldiers are being guarded. And then just beyond that, you've got Nelson's Ferry. Nelson's Ferry, there is a larger British force that is bivouacked there. And so Marion recognizes that if they are going to be destroyed, the most likely or the most dangerous course of action, well, there's two really. The most dangerous course of action in the situation would either be the British in the plantation house are aware of Marion's presence and they know he's coming and they're anticipating it. So they're setting up a more defensive posture, or after they hit the objective, there's a bunch of noise, something goes awry, they're stalled out for whatever reason, they get into a gunfight, there's just something happens on the objective that prevents them from leaving in a speedy manner. And somehow the British at Nelson's Ferry are warned and they quickly move in and destroy Marion's force. So he sends Hugh to set up a blocking position as a sort of early warning system. And by the way, not to just beat a dead horse here, but this is all stuff that's done. If any of this sounds familiar, it's because when you were watching even if you're a guy who wasn't in the military or special operations, even though infantry guys know this better than most special operations guys, in Black Hawk Down, Task Force Ranger, this is like exactly what they do almost to a T. The Rangers go out, they set up blocking positions for the same reason Marion has deployed Hugh to set up a blocking position, highest avenues of approach where enemy reinforcements could come from. Simultaneously, if there were squirters, guys that escaped from the plantation house, more than likely they would run down this road to get away as quickly as humanly possible. And of course, they run right into Hugh. This is so advanced. It's just, it's awesome. Okay. So they've got their blocking position. Marion dismounts and begins to approach the house from the rear where they believe there is a lack of enemy presence. And his goal is to hit the house from behind, no pun intended. And if you know anything about life or military missions, Murphy's Law always comes into play. Murphy's Law, for those of you who are unaware, it is simply the idea that if something can happen, it will happen. And it does happen. While Hugh is set up, there is a British enemy sentry that is making his way down the road. And he is able to fire off a shot at Hugh's group, his squad. And this, I want to just pause for a second. This is a really incredible moment. And the reason I say that is because I kind of doubt that Lieutenant Horry and Marion sat down and said, okay, what's our most likely course of action? What's our most dangerous course of action? And so Hugh has to make a split-second decision here where there are so many things going through his mind. Number one, Did the British at the Plantation House hear that shot? Are they now setting up a defensive posture that could very easily destroy the rest of our force with Marion? Did the other British reinforcements at Nelson's Ferry that are bivouacked there, did they hear the shot? Are they coming? And not any other officer, but a lot of other individuals who could have been in his shoes probably would have just broken contact. I mean, obviously they didn't have radios. He couldn't radio Marion. There's no way he could communicate with him what had just happened. So Marion's probably sitting there wondering, was that our guys? Was that their guys? Are they going to rally inside of this house? Are we about to be overrun and destroyed? And Hugh, being an absolute fucking pipe hitter, instantaneously reacts and he turns his force and charges and bolts towards the Plantation House. And I can only surmise that his thought was, God forbid the British know or begin to rally themselves and collect their weapons, and Marion is caught in the field in the backyard, and they're going to just receive volley after volley of British fire from a defensive position, because they're inside the house, and then Marion would be in the open field and just get crushed. And Hugh goes straight for the front door. And according to historians, he made as much noise as humanly possible to create the illusion that there was a much larger force coming at them. But he moved so aggressively and so decisively that the British inside of the Plantation House didn't even have time to react. I mean, it's unclear whether they took the shot seriously, if they just kind of let it go and didn't think anything of it, or if they decided to get their shit together and sort of mumble around and look around what's going on, looking out windows. It doesn't matter. Hugh moves in so fast. He's like fucking Revolutionary War CAG out here. He makes GBRS group look like a bunch of pussies, frankly. He sees the weapons that have been stacked. For some reason, the British stacked all their weapons at the front door. Who knows why? And he sees the weapons and he directs a couple of his men to guard the weapons. And he just goes full fucking CQB, kicks down the door, busts in, no limited penetration, musket in hand. And then a split second later, Marion, again, like fucking CAG or something, coordinates and comes in through the back door, and they hit this house simultaneously. And the British are just shitting their pants. They have no idea what's going on. And very quickly, 2 of them are dead. 5 are wounded, and they took a whole slew of British prisoners like that. And let me tell you something. They weren't clearing corners. They weren't popping out flashbangs. They just used speed, surprise, and violence of action to get the job done. There was no rehearsals. I mean, again, I'm a huge fan of Robert Rogers, but this is their first mission. Just to remind you, I know I said this earlier, their guys were not, to call them soldiers is a stretch. They'd been under Marion's leadership for 2 days at this point, and they're hitting objectives and freeing 150 POWs. Marion reports this. He says, quote, "On the 20th instant, I attacked a guard of 63rd and Prince of Wales Regiment with a number of Tories at the Great Savannah near Nelson's Ferry, took 22 regulars and 2 Tory prisoners, and retook 150 Continentals of the Maryland line, 1 wagon, and of course, and a drum, 1 captain, and 1 subaltern was also captured. Our loss is only 1 killed, and Captain Benson slightly wounded in the head." He gets his reporting wrong for some reason. It's kind of bizarre. The Patriots only sustained 2 wounded, no KIA, and they had freed 147 American POWs. It's mind-boggling. Of course, in the aftermath, he offered this group of newly released prisoners, if you want to come join our little band of Ranger CAG operators, you can do so. Only 3 end up joining. 85. This is amazing. 85 of these individuals were so demoralized by what they had experienced and what was going on at that moment in the war that they actually just wanted to continue to Charleston to be POWs until they believed the British would just eventually win. The remaining 60 ended up going to North Carolina. Okay. I know I sort of paused and went into a variety of things, but I sort of want to just go through how much of an incredible military feat this was by Marion, and go through the motions of what he did, and also juxtapose another, was a kind of similar mission that we see today, or we saw not literally today, but in the sort of modern era. In the Vietnam War, there was an operation called Ivory Coast. Many of you would know it. It's more popularly known as the Sumter Raid. To this day, the Sumter Raid is considered one of the most incredible operations that has been executed in American military history, and certainly in the Vietnam War. Essentially, what had happened was a group of special forces and soldiers, along with a whole joint special operations command. There wasn't JSOC, but it was one of the first operations where they were utilizing every branch of the military to execute the mission. It was a huge deal. They had gotten intel that there were a bunch of American POWs and Vietnamese allies who were captured at the Son Tay prisoner of war camp. And so they were going to go bust them out. They prepared this thing for months. They went over, they combed through all the intelligence. They executed the mission. Unfortunately, the POWs had been moved in July. I believe they executed the mission in November. And although it was tactically completely sound, well rehearsed, well executed, they obviously didn't rescue any POWs. Regardless, it's still considered to be a success. Nobody knows about Marion's POW breakout at this plantation. And frankly, what he accomplished in this one mission is something that we should all still be talking about to this day. He had no handbook. There was no SOPs. There was no oversight. He was taking whatever knowledge he had acquired during the Cherokee War, and then whatever other military, and obviously, his experiences as an infantry officer later on, and common sense, quite frankly, and was able to lead a group of guys that had no military experience to hit a house, hit an objective for the millionth time. There was no CQB. They were clearing a house with muskets, and then after a round, they were going presumably to bayonets, which they probably didn't have. So some sort of hand-to-hand combat, beating Brits over the head with the butt of their muskets. And they took very little casualties. I mean, it's really just absolutely amazing what they were able to do. They set up the ORP. He did the reconnaissance mission. He set up the blocking positions. I mean, by all available sort of modern special operations standards, he absolutely crushed it. And it appears as though, for the most part, he was just making it up as he went. In the aftermath, the British were absolutely furious. They were bewildered by what had happened. General Cornwallis was beside himself. He had been directed by Clinton to obviously quell any sort of rebellions, which he had believed he had done. In fact, 2 months earlier, prior to this operation, he had informed Clinton that South Carolina was pacified and he was ready to move on to North Carolina. But with Marion in his backyard behind enemy lines, harassing his men, conducting operations as he had just done, he was terrified that he would basically cut off the British supply lines from Charleston into North Carolina. And therefore, General Cornwallis could not continue his operation northward. He ended up deploying an individual named Major Weems, Wemyss, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Wemyss, spelled Wemyss, to hunt down Marion and squash the colonial militia. He wrote, quote, "I've ordered in the most positive manner that every militiaman who had borne arms with us and afterwards joined the enemy should be immediately hanged. I desire that you will take the most vigorous measures to extinguish the rebellion in the district in which you command, and that you will obey the strictest manner the directions I have given in this letter relative to the treatment of this country." And the Patriot, Major Weems, is played by Jason Isaacs, who in the movie his name isn't Weems, it's Colonel William Tavington. In the film, Tavington is absolutely brutal. He hangs colonials, he murders families, he burns down homes, he burns down a Presbyterian church. All of this seems slightly exaggerated. Quite frankly, you watch it and it's like, all right, we get it. He's the baddie. Whatever. Got it. But all of it is actually very true. The British were absolutely fucking ruthless. John Aller, in his book, The Swamp Fox, he writes, quote, 2 weeks earlier, his name, Marion, was unknown to the British. And now suddenly he was capable of operating behind Cornwallis's lines and harassing his right and eastern flank. It was a vexation his lordship needed to eliminate before he could launch his planned invasion of North Carolina. The success of Marion's hit-and-run tactics so infuriated the British High Command that at least half a dozen death squads, beginning with Weems, were dispatched in sequence to go after him. On September 7th, in pursuit of Marion, Weems, like I said, burned down a Presbyterian church. In the days that followed, he burned down several homes and hung a ferryman in front of his family. Weems conducted a scorched earth policy, burning 50 homes and plantations. His men destroyed blacksmith shops, mills, and looms, and shot milk cows and sheep. And despite his best efforts, could not find Marion. Aller describes Marion's resolve as mythical in nature. He writes, quote, although he lacked physical presence or a magnetic personality, they regarded him, meaning Marion, with awe. Part of their reverence was due to his success, which naturally bred respect. But it was his steady, equitable character that most caused them to follow where he led. Quote, according to one contemporary, he had no uproarious humor, wrote one man who spoke with surviving members of Marion's brigade. He goes on, he says, quote, at most a quiet smile lighted up his features, and although capable of sarcasm and sharp retorts and even playfulness among his friends and military intimates, his demeanor was quiet and subdued. He, quote, was singularly considerate of the sensibilities of others and had his temper under rare control. Marion was cool, calm, collected at all times, which meant his men believed that despite whatever hazards they may face, he could lead them to victory. Towards the end of September, Marion's men had retreated into South Carolina, but they had quickly heard what was going on the home front, that Weems, along with a whole multiplicity of other British regulars, were absolutely just destroying their homes, their lives, and their families were in the crosshairs. And then they decided to return back to South Carolina and continue their engagement. Of course, if you know anything about insurgency and counterinsurgency, the British attempt to quell this rebellion and destroy any sort of support infrastructure within the region, they just made it 10 times worse. Marion had more men that wanted to join the cause. He had more families that if they could not fight, they would feed and house his men. And Marion's first major confrontation was at Horse Creek at the Plantation, was an absolute triumph. Aiken notes, quote, the engagement at Horse Creek was vitally important for several reasons. First, Horse Creek set the stage for the remainder of Marion's campaign. Often in warfare, even if a belligerent has overwhelming advantage, quote, the loser of the first class will normally find it very difficult indeed to rebuild the necessary self-confidence of his men. Basically suggesting this first mission was absolutely vital to what would basically create the momentum for further success. And if it had been a failure, he could have very easily had nothing but deserters and then no brigade, no swamp fox, no guerrilla fighting in the background behind enemy lines. Aiken goes on, Marion was able to gain the advantage at Horse Creek. And second, Horse Creek gave Marion and his partisan force an opportunity to assess the unit. This engagement allowed for the development, testing, and refinement or validation of the partisans' tactics, techniques, and SOPs. Third, the Patriot victory was the first glimmer of hope after Camden and served to uplift Patriot morale throughout the region. And fourth, the engagement at Horse Creek began to drain resources from the enemy and reduced British and Loyalist freedom of action. Okay, in the next episode, we're going to hone in on some more of Francis Marion's sort of major accomplishments or missions or operations. With that said, a lot of historians focus on a whole handful of, again, major engagements, and they sort of overlook all of the little things he was doing. But just as a side note to let you know, aside from these missions, he was also doing presence patrols, recon, intelligence gathering, getting supplies, recruiting men, essentially doing a lot of minor things that get overlooked because of these really cool operations, quite frankly. Anyways, we will see you next time. Thanks for joining me. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. Deuces.